In the late 1800s, a young man named Edwin Barnes got off a freight train in West Orange, New Jersey, with basically nothing, no money worth mentioning, no connections, no education that would impress anyone. He walked up to the laboratory of Thomas Edison, already one of the most famous inventors alive, and told the staff he wanted a job. Now here's the part everyone leaves out. Barnes didn't just want a job. He didn't want to sweep floors or run errands or eventually, maybe, get promoted to some respectable little position. He walked in there with one specific, oddly precise idea already fully formed in his head. He was going to become Edison's business partner, not employee, partner, a man with no money and no resume, deciding, before he'd even been hired, exactly what his future with one of the most powerful men in America was going to look like. Edison gave him a menial job. Of course he did. Nobody hands a stranger a partnership. And for years, Barnes did small, unglamorous work around that laboratory. But here's what he never did. He never let go of that one specific image in his mind. He didn't sit around thinking, I hope something good happens to me someday. He held one exact picture, himself, standing next to Edison, as a partner. Years later, Edison invented a piece of office equipment, the Ediphone, an early dictation machine, and his own sales team didn't believe in it. They thought it wouldn't sell. Barnes, still hanging around after all that time, stepped up and said he could sell it. He got the chance. He sold it so well, so relentlessly, that Edison eventually made him the exclusive distributor for the machine nationwide. Barnes became, in every meaningful sense, Edison's business partner, the exact picture he had carried in his head for years, built out of nothing but imagination and refusal to let it fade. Napoleon Hill used that story as one of his central proofs for a simple, slightly uncomfortable idea. Money doesn't just follow hard work. It follows a very specific, very rare kind of imagination. Not the daydreaming kind, not the wouldn't it be nice kind. A sharper, more useful kind that most people either never develop or develop and then dismiss as childish. So here's what we're covering today. 10 signs that you already have that rare kind of imagination in you, whether you've been using it on purpose or not. Stick around, because sign 7 is one almost nobody recognizes in themselves until it's pointed out directly. Let's get into it. Sign 1. You see combinations, not just objects. Here's something most people don't realize about how wealth-building ideas actually get created. Almost none of them are invented from scratch. Almost all of them are combinations of things that already existed, just never put together before. The car wasn't a brand new invention. The engine existed. The carriage existed. Someone combined them. The smartphone wasn't one miracle invention. It was a phone, a camera, a computer, and the internet. All things that already existed separately, fused into one object by people who looked at 4 existing pieces and saw one missing connection. Hill made a very specific distinction in his work between 2 types of imagination. There's creative imagination, the rarer, almost mystical kind, where genuinely new ideas seem to arrive out of nowhere. And then there's synthetic imagination, which is far more common, far more trainable, and honestly responsible for the overwhelming majority of fortunes ever built. Synthetic imagination doesn't invent from nothing. It rearranges what already exists into something nobody had bothered to assemble yet. If you're the person in the group who looks at 2 completely unrelated things, a subscription model and a haircut, a video game and a workout routine, a coffee shop and a co-working space, and instinctively thinks, wait, what if these were actually the same thing? That's not a random quirk of your personality. That is, very literally, the exact mental machinery that built a large percentage of the wealth in modern history. You're not weird for thinking that way. You're just underusing a genuinely valuable skill. Sign 2. Boredom triggers ideas instead of numbness. Pay close attention to what happens in your head the moment you're properly bored. Stuck in a waiting room, sitting in traffic, standing in a slow line with your phone dead. Some people go completely blank in that moment. Total mental static, just waiting for the boredom to end. Other people, and if you're one of them, you already know it, start generating ideas almost immediately. Random business names, fixes for things that annoy them. Entire hypothetical products they'll never build, just because their brain refuses to sit still, with nothing to chew on. That reaction is not a distraction from productivity. It's arguably the most productive thing your brain does all day, and almost nobody schedules time for it on purpose. Hill talked at length about the idea that the imagination needs quiet, unstimulated space to actually function, which sounds almost old-fashioned in a world where every idle second gets filled with a phone screen. But think about how many of the most famous eureka moments in history happened in the shower, on a walk, half asleep in bed, never at a desk, staring directly at the problem. Boredom isn't empty time. For a mind wired the right way, it's the workshop opening for business. If your brain treats boredom as an invitation to build something instead of a void to escape, that reaction is doing more heavy lifting for your future than you've probably ever given it credit for. Sign 3. You daydream in specific detail, not vague fantasy. There's a massive difference between two kinds of daydreaming, and almost nobody separates them out, even though they lead to completely different lives. Vague daydreaming sounds like, I'd love to be rich someday. It'd be nice to run my own thing. I want to be successful. Nice thoughts, completely useless as fuel, because there's nothing in them specific enough to actually act on. Specific daydreaming, the Barnes kind, from the top of this video, sounds completely different. It has a location, a dollar figure, a conversation with an actual sentence in it, a specific room, a specific title, a specific outcome you could practically describe to a stranger in detail if they asked you to. If you catch yourself daydreaming and it comes with actual specifics, the exact size of the team, the exact look of the office, the exact way the conversation with the client goes, the exact number in the bank account, that level of detail is not a childish habit you should be embarrassed about. It's your brain doing something close to blueprinting. Vague dreams stay dreams because there's nothing to build from. Specific ones eventually start looking suspiciously like plans, whether you intended them to or not. Sign 4. You get genuinely frustrated that something doesn't exist yet. This one shows up as irritation, not inspiration, which is exactly why most people don't recognize it as a strength. You're using some app, some product, some service, and at some point you think, with actual mild anger, why does this not exist yet? This is so obvious. Somebody should have built this years ago. Not, wouldn't it be cool if? Genuine frustration. Almost personal offense, that the gap in the market has been left sitting there, unfilled, for so long. That specific flavor of irritation is worth paying attention to, because most people, when they hit an inconvenience, simply adapt to it and move on with their day. They complain for 10 seconds and forget about it by lunch. A smaller number of people get stuck on the gap. They keep coming back to it in idle moments. They start sketching, even loosely, what the fix would actually look like. That stuck feeling, that refusal to just accept the inconvenience as permanent, is one of the most reliable tells of the kind of imagination Hill was describing. Most fortunes, when you trace them back far enough, started with someone who simply refused to shrug at a problem the way everyone else around them did. Sign 5. Problems annoy you into solving them, not just complaining about them. This one's closely related to the last sign, but it's about your response after the frustration hits, not the frustration itself. Some people hit a wall, complain loudly and articulately about how broken the system is, feel briefly validated by the complaint, and then just live with it. That's most people, most of the time, and there's nothing shameful about that. Genuinely, not every irritation deserves your energy, but a smaller group does something different. The complaint turns into a rough sketch of a fix within minutes, not a full business plan, nothing that polished, just an instinctive, okay, but what if it worked like this instead, running in the background almost involuntarily. You don't even necessarily choose to do it, it just happens, the same way some people can't hear a song without their foot starting to tap. Hill's research kept circling back to something similar in the men and women he studied for his work. Nearly all of them described their big breakthroughs as starting with irritation at an existing problem, not inspiration out of a clear blue sky. Annoyance, it turns out, is a completely underrated starting point for wealth. Inspiration is rare and unpredictable. Annoyance happens to everyone constantly. The only difference is what a person's imagination automatically does with it. Sign 6. You imagine the end result vividly before you even start. Some people start a project and figure out what done looks like somewhere along the way. Other people can describe, in vivid and specific detail, exactly what finished looks like before they've done a single piece of actual work. This isn't about being unrealistic or getting ahead of yourself in a naive way. It's a specific mental skill, the ability to hold a fully formed picture of an outcome in your head with enough clarity that it functions almost like a destination on a map, something you can navigate toward, even when the road there is completely unclear. Hill wrote extensively about this exact mechanism, the idea that a clearly defined, vividly imagined goal acts almost like a magnet, pulling behavior toward it in ways people don't consciously notice. It's not mystical, it's closer to how a GPS works. You can't navigate anywhere useful with somewhere better than here as your destination. You need actual coordinates. People who can picture, in real detail, the finished version of a book, a business, a body, a home, long before it exists, are giving their own behavior an actual target to aim at instead of a vague direction to wander in. Sign 7. You steal ideas from completely unrelated fields. Here's the sign almost nobody clocks in themselves, because it feels less like imagination and more like just paying attention to random stuff. You watch a documentary about ant colonies, and somehow your brain connects it to how your team at work should be structured. You read about how restaurants handle kitchen workflow, and it gives you an idea for organizing your own daily schedule. You notice how a video game handles difficulty progression, and it changes how you think about pricing tiers for your business. Most people keep categories of knowledge in completely separate mental boxes: work stuff over here, hobbies over there, random trivia in its own drawer, never touching. The rare kind of imagination Hill described doesn't respect those boxes. It constantly smuggles ideas across the border from one field into a completely unrelated one, and it usually does this without being asked to, almost as an involuntary reflex. This cross-pollination habit is worth noticing specifically because it's easy to dismiss as just being a curious or scattered person. It's actually one of the more reliable engines behind genuinely original ideas, because the most valuable insight in any field is often just a completely obvious idea borrowed from a different field where everyone already knew it. If you keep finding yourself dragging concepts across unrelated categories without meaning to, that's not mental clutter, that's the machinery working exactly as intended. Sign 8. Your imagination sometimes scares you a little. This one sounds strange until you've actually experienced it, and then it makes complete sense. Every so often, you picture a version of your future, a business at a certain scale, a level of visibility, a level of responsibility, and it doesn't just excite you, it genuinely unsettles you a little, not because it seems impossible, because some part of you suspects it isn't impossible, and that's the uncomfortable part. Fear of failure is common and doesn't tell you much on its own. Everyone fears failure, but this specific, quieter fear, the mild vertigo you get from imagining a plausible, sizable future for yourself, is a completely different signal. It means your imagination has already run ahead of your current resources, your current confidence, your current sense of what you're allowed to want. It's not showing you a fantasy, it's showing you a version of your life your current identity hasn't caught up to yet. Hill talked about the gap between what a person can imagine and what a person currently believes they deserve, and how closing that gap, not the initial idea itself, is usually the real work involved in getting wealthy. If your own imagination occasionally makes you a little uneasy with how plausible it feels, that unease isn't a warning to shrink the vision, it's a sign the vision is already realistic enough to be worth taking seriously. Sign 9. You rehearse conversations and scenarios before they happen. You're in the shower, or driving, or lying in bed, and you're running an entire imagined conversation in your head: the pitch to the investor, the negotiation with the client, the difficult talk with a business partner, not vaguely, word for word sometimes, with their imagined responses and your prepared comebacks. Some people find this exhausting or slightly embarrassing, like it's a sign of overthinking or anxiety, and sometimes it is just anxiety, worth being honest about that. But there's a very different version of this same habit, a rehearsal, not a spiral, where you're essentially running simulations of your future, the way a pilot runs a flight simulator before ever touching a real plane. This kind of mental rehearsal is a documented habit among people who consistently perform well under pressure in high-stakes moments, precisely because their brain has already been there dozens of times by the time the real moment shows up. If you rehearse important scenarios in your head before they happen, and you notice it actually makes you sharper and calmer in the real version, rather than more anxious, that's your imagination functioning as a genuine rehearsal space, not a source of dread. That's an asset, not a quirk to apologize for. Sign 10. Small inconveniences become idea prompts. Last one, and it's probably the most everyday version of everything we've covered. A door that's awkward to open with your hands full, a form at the doctor's office that asks the same question 3 different ways, a 5-minute wait for something that should take 30 seconds. Most people experience these tiny frictions constantly, all day, and process them as background noise, mildly annoying, instantly forgotten the second the inconvenience ends. If instead these tiny frictions regularly turn into a flicker of, there's probably a better way to do this, even for things you have zero intention of ever actually fixing, that reflex is worth paying attention to. It means your imagination treats the entire physical and digital world as slightly editable, slightly improvable, rather than fixed and finished the way most people unconsciously assume it is. Nearly every product, service, or business you've ever used started exactly there, with someone experiencing an ordinary inconvenience that everyone else had simply learned to tolerate, and refusing to file it away as normal. If small frictions regularly turn into small what-if thoughts in your head, you're not being difficult or overly critical. You're running the exact same background process that eventually built entire industries. So let's go back to that freight train and the young man with nothing to his name walking into Edison's laboratory. What actually made Barnes different wasn't intelligence. Plenty of smarter, better educated people worked in that same building and never got anywhere close to a partnership. It wasn't even luck, though luck obviously played some role, the way it does in every success story if you look hard enough. What made him different was that his imagination did something very specific, very early, before he'd earned any right to it. It built a precise, detailed picture of a future that didn't exist yet, and then it refused to let that picture fade, year after year, through menial jobs and slow progress and every reasonable excuse to give up on something that specific and that audacious. Everything on this list, the combinations, the ideas triggered by boredom, the specific daydreams, the frustration at gaps, the instinct to fix rather than just complain, the vivid end results, the cross-pollinated ideas, the unsettling futures, the rehearsed conversations, the small inconveniences that turn into questions, all of it is the same basic machinery Barnes was running, just applied in smaller, quieter, everyday ways in most of our lives. The good news is this particular kind of imagination isn't some rare genetic gift handed to a lucky few. Hill's entire body of work is built on the opposite claim, that it's trainable, that it strengthens with deliberate use, and that most people simply never exercise it because nobody ever told them it was worth exercising. If you recognized yourself in even a handful of these 10 signs, you're not imagining things, you already have the raw material. The only real question left is whether you're going to point it at something specific enough to actually build. If you saw yourself in 3 or more of these, drop the number in the comments and tell me which one hit hardest, because I want to know which of these is the most common one people actually recognize in themselves. And if you've got a Barnes moment of your own, a specific, oddly precise picture you've been carrying around in your head for years, one you haven't told many people about, leave it in the comments too. Sometimes just saying it out loud is the first real step toward it. I'll see you in the next one.